Cable news networks have been obsessing over finding evidence proving that President Trump is acting in a corrupt manner since he took office. It's led to multiple investigations into the president's dealings with foreign governments, and some news outlets are now looking into the behavior of Hunter Biden during his father's time as vice president.
But are Americans too concerned about rooting out corruption in our government? That's exactly what one expert thinks. In his piece for NBC.com, Tim Modell writes, the U.S. is not a very corrupt country, and the discrepancy between corruption's reality and our perception can only damage rather than strengthen our democracy. Tim is a Havikhurst Fellow at Miami University's Havikhurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies in Oxford, Ohio, and he joins us now via Skype. Tim, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me on, Saagar and Krystal.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, I am skeptical of your case, but make it anyway.
Yeah, go ahead. Before we start.
Before we dismantle it,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Fantastic. I think some people are taking it a little further than I actually anticipated. This is pretty much a piece that's a call to reason. There's a lot for us to be proud of in America, and one of those things is our consistent reputation as a country that has maintained low levels of corruption. We're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. No country is. Here, right now, we are facing issues. I recognize them with lobbying. Lobbying is certainly, for the last many years, has been at the center of political discussion, and lobbying does kind of put a stress on our system. And certainly in the presidential administration right now, there are a lot of activities that are of great concern. But I'm an expert on Russia. That's the perspective that I'm coming from. And in Russia, corruption is so pervasive. It's so terrible. And I want to remind people that we live in a surprisingly, maybe for some, a surprisingly reasonable country with robust institutions that, for the most part, do work on behalf of citizens.
Mm-hmm. So, Tim, I mean, the real question is like, why is it good enough to settle for being not Russia, right? That's really what it is, which is like, sure, yeah, I mean, we don't have a dictator that controls the means of production via a stem of oligarchs, but why shouldn't we settle for having the best system in the world?
It's not necessarily about settling. I do recognize that we do struggle with corruption, and I'm not saying that we should settle. In fact, I'm saying very much the opposite. My concern isn't that we are giving up or that we should be not talking about corruption at all. My concern is that the discussion of corruption has become hysterical. And hysteria, that's what can be very damaging to democratic institutional stability. That's what can drive people away from political participation. And when we don't have political participation, we don't have a democracy.
Yeah.
So my concern is really about hysteria.
Well, and here's the other question, like define corruption, because we don't have the same sort of like blatant bribery that you see in a lot of, countries like Russia or even India or other places around the world. But, if you look at what actually happens in this town, if you look at the soft corruption and influence of money in politics, it's endemic. I mean, there was research that was done that found that Congress did not champion the priorities of the American people at all, while on the other hand, they were deeply responsive to the needs of donors. So I don't know how you can look at that sort of systemic problem that is impacting every single law that's passed in the country and say, we're being too hysterical about corruption.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we are facing these issues. So traditionally in economics and political science and in a lot of other fields, corruption is defined pretty narrowly. It's defined as the abuse of public office for private gain. Now, when it comes to lobbying is kind of this interesting case. I mean, you're absolutely right that lobbying is in many ways a fairly criticized issue. It does disproportionately benefit people, corporations, ideas that are backed by a lot of money and a lot of resources. And the issue of money in politics, and especially dark money, that's a real problem. That's something that we really should be dealing with. But again, these practices are still better than what we see in so much of the world. In other countries, politicians are not just getting campaign donations, they're getting bribes. And these bribes, they're going directly into their own pockets and benefiting them privately. And that's something that's a very different case from what we see in the United States.
Yeah, I think you're right. But whether the cash flows directly into somebody's pocket or their son's pocket or their cousin's pocket or their law firm's pocket and then they get, crazy amounts of reimbursements, it really just seems like what Krystal is saying. I mean, does it really make it better off that in our nation's capital that you can file a form like a FARA registration and still pay a guy $300,000 a month in order to represent the interests of, like, say, the UAE or Qatar? I mean, that seems very corrupt to me. And just because we all know about it and exists within a Department of Justice filing center doesn't mean that it's okay.
Yeah. I completely agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree that we're not perfect. We're very much not perfect. And on any ranking of corruption, we're not at the top. We're at the kind of mid-top. There are plenty of countries, especially in Western Europe, but even authoritarian countries like Singapore, they're doing far better than us at reducing corruption. And that's something that we can use to our advantage. We can learn from how Sweden, for example, fights corruption. They have an anti-corruption unit within their government that's entirely dedicated to fighting corruption. We certainly have an underdeveloped legal system when it comes to corruption, but on the whole, we're just not that bad. And I want to move the conversation away from hysteria and more toward the kinds of things that you're raising. Well, what kind of laws do we need? What kind of improvements can we actually make? A more measured discussion.
Sure.
Tim, thank you so much for making the case. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Appreciate it a lot.
Yep.
We'll have more Rising after this.